All right, so we're working on building our knowledge base of statistics in general. We learned about statistical questions in our first lesson. So if you have a statistical question that you would like to answer, we talked about the types of studies you could use, sample survey, experiment, observational study. You want to make sure that you are doing a study that does not have bias. And now we're going to take a look at sampling methods. So, sampling methods. In order to select a sample that is likely to be representative of the population, you need to choose members of the sample using randomness. The simplest way to use randomness is with a simple random sample. In a simple random sample, each member of the population is equally likely chosen, and each possible sample of the size you want is equally likely chosen. Some sampling methods can involve randomness in other ways to select a sample. Some sampling methods do not use enough randomness to give reliable results. So if you want the best results to answer a statistical question, you can choose a type of study to do with a sample. The sample is going to represent the population, and for it to be the truest representation, this is what we're talking about, the simple random sample. So we have some different types of random sampling to talk about. Care must be taken to avoid bias. If there's bias in your study whatsoever, whether it's the people you choose to ask, the way you're asking a question, the type of experiment you do, then that taints your results in answering your statistical question. So we're going to avoid bias, and here are some ways that we can do that. We have something called stratified sampling. Stratified sampling is when a population is divided into groups with similar characteristics, and a sample is randomly chosen from each group. So in your note packet, all of these little people are gray. So what I would like you to do is maybe circle the ones you see on my in color notes that I have, the ones that are blue, just so you know, you can see a difference between the blue and the green. So what's happening with stratified sampling is the population is divided into groups with similar characteristics, and then a sample is randomly chosen from each group. So we would choose this blue person, this blue person, this blue person randomly. From this other group, we would choose this blue person, this blue person, this blue person. So that's stratified sampling. We have something called cluster sampling. Cluster sampling is when a population is divided into convenient clusters and entire clusters are chosen at random as the sample. So we have a cluster, a cluster, a cluster, and then we're choosing to sample this cluster right here, these blue people. So we would sample that entire cluster. We have something called systematic sampling. Systematic sampling is when you start with one member chosen at random, then use a rule such as every third member of the population and select members of the sample. So in this example, we can see our blue people, 1, 2, we would choose this person. 1, 2, 3, we're going to choose that blue person. 1, 2, 3, we're going to choose that person for our study. 1, 2, 3. So we're choosing every third person. There are some sampling methods that have a high risk of bias. These are the ones we would avoid. Convenience sampling is only choosing subjects that are in close proximity or easy to get to. So if I wanted to ask a statistical question about the opinion of Algebra 2 students on something, and I just asked you guys, because you're the ones I see in class, That's convenience sampling. It's convenient for me. Are you representative of every single Algebra 2 student at Rockford High School? No, you're not. It's a convenient sample for me. Self-selected sampling is using a sample made up of volunteers. So people that say, oh yeah, B, please pick me. I really, really want to answer your question, or I want to be part of that study, or I'm filling out a survey voluntarily. People that self-select tend to have opinions one way or the other. They're just not representing the population in a random way that these other sampling methods would. All right, so let's just take a look at some examples and we'll quickly identify what type of sampling we're doing. So if our study involves starting with a randomly chosen ID number, every fifth student ID number was chosen, and that student was asked to fill out a survey. This is an example of systematic sampling. And this is unlikely to be biased. So there was a system to choose the sample. They picked a random start and then they chose every fifth student. All right, the next study, a retailer put feedback cards at the front of its store. They got responses from 22% of their customers. So this is self-selected sampling. Customers are on their own filling out a feedback card. So it's not random and it's very likely to be biased. All right, our next study, a city wants to know what % of people in the city own a cat or dog, a dog or cat. A city worker goes door to door in the neighborhood around City Hall to ask people about their pets. So this city worker works in City Hall. They just went in the neighborhood close by, just the neighborhood around the City Hall to ask those people. So this is an example of convenience sampling. It was convenient for them to just sample people in the nearest neighborhood. Does that neighborhood represent the entire city? Not necessarily. So this is likely a biased, it would likely give biased results. We would want to avoid that. All right, part B, what sampling method is used in the following example? Is the method likely to be biased or not? The population is grouped according to age, and a random sample is chosen from each group. So because we're grouping by a characteristic, and then within that characteristic, in this case age, we're randomly picking people, this is what stratified sampling looks like. And then last, a number of hospitals around the country were randomly chosen. Within each hospital, all of the nurses were chosen for the study. So this is an example of cluster sampling. The clusters are the hospitals around the country, and then they chose a cluster to sample. So the hospital, they chose a hospital, and then they surveyed everybody in the hospital, or all the nurses in the hospital. So this is cluster sampling. Oh, and then are they likely to be biased or not? So we're going to say not biased for both of these. These are good sampling methods. They do reduce the bias in the study.